background. I'm here to speak on, if you will, kind of IT risk, kind of an introduction, a high-level overview of it. I'll touch on kind of the reasons why I thought this is important, because I've been in the field for quite a while. Just kind of a background on me. I come from an operational background. I was a system administrator for Unix and Windows before I moved into security. So I have a technical background, though nowadays I'm not a security engineer. I'm more what we call a consultant, working in what we call governance, risk, and compliance. As I said, I go and work with companies, take a look at their security program, a lot of healthcare, a lot of finance, a lot of others, and assess them against various models and frameworks. And risk is what I think is very, very important. And unfortunately, I get a little frustrated by some attitude by some in the security realm which think that risk is something else, and I don't agree with that. So I like this. Do you think it's better to live in stupefying security or take risks and live life on the edge? I think it's better to accept danger and live to the fullest. I take by your silence that you agree. So we're going to talk about basically what it is, why we should care about. We're going to get into some of the risk terms. I think it's important, kind of a basic understanding of some of the terminology. One thing you do have to be careful of is there's different risk models, risk frameworks. We're going to look at a basic one, and then I'm going to talk about some of the others that are out there. There's many others. I picked 4 that I've seen used repeatedly with a lot of different works and so forth, but there's a lot more out there. It's almost overwhelming. And there was a few that are like, should I talk about this, or it's too much? And then I always like to give resources. I give you kind of an introduction to something, but obviously like, hey, where do I want to go next? And so I like to spend a little bit of time on where you go next after what we talked about here. So what is risk? And there's various formulas and so forth. The basic one is basically an impact on the organization times probability, likelihood of it happening. That's the kind of the basic understanding of risk. Something bad will happen. How often would it happen? What's the impact? There's other formulas that they sometimes they pull in threat and vulnerability times the asset. And the thing is, as security professionals, we oftentimes are just thinking about the threat and the vulnerability. Vulnerability is, the system has an open door. Something has to be patched, or someone set up the system and they use the default password. They didn't secure it well. So that's the vulnerability. The threat is, hackers. Someone inside, an employee. And so oftentimes we as IT security professionals, we just think about the threats and the vulnerabilities, but we need to understand that that impacts our organization, and it's really a risk that we're trying to deal with. I mean, otherwise, why are we worrying about those threats and vulnerabilities? We worry because of the risk. And there's also this formula that gets a little bit more complex, and I really don't like it because it just muddies it. Now, when I was preparing for the C-Risk certification, and I'll talk more about that later, I took a class from a guy named Jay Ranaday, and he has kind of a better definition, I think, but it's a little bit more wordy because it's better for understanding risk. So this is what he says. Threats, exploits, vulnerabilities, i.e. a hacker can break into the system because you didn't set it up properly. This damages an asset. There's all kinds of different assets. We'll talk about that shortly. This breaks a business process or processes, causes damage to the company. They can't get business done. And that's the risk. That's why we want to address those threats and those vulnerabilities to avoid that risk. Now, to take care of that, we put in place something called controls. And all you probably have dealt with controls. You probably just never heard them referred to as that. And we keep applying these controls to the risk, to the environment, until what is left is acceptable to management. Not to you, not to me, what is acceptable to management. Because a lot of times the things that we put into place, sometimes our fellow employees don't like it. Oh, that slows me down. I don't like that may be, but management has decided that's what we're going to do. I'm not going to get too much into control, but I should speak a little bit more on it. Like I said, controls address risk. The thing to be understand is they are not for free. There is a cost to implementing a control. They slow down business. They cost money. You want that fancy firewall in place to keep hackers out. It costs money. You want to implement a full disk encryption, environment in your system, in your overall environment, and have full disk encryption on all the laptops. Comes with a cost. Not just the cost in terms of rolling out that software to all the laptops, but for those of you who may have not have used a system that has full disk encryption, guess what? It takes longer for that system to come up. Where I used to work, we implemented full disk encryption on every laptop. Didn't matter who the heck you were. You had a laptop, you had full disk encryption. And we had employees that complained because what that meant was when they powered up the laptop, at first it comes up and wants their full disk encryption password to unencrypt the system, and then boots into the operating system to come up, and then they have to log into the system. People complain, oh, it takes too long, and of course those two passwords, that full disk encryption password and your operating system password, are two totally separate things that are not in sync at all. So people complain, but management decided that hit on employees' productivity was worth it to protect our data. There are different types of controls, policies, procedures, process, gets into physical, organizational. We also talk about there being non-technical controls and technical controls. A non-technical control would be a policy that says, okay, passwords would be in this form. 8 characters, upper and lower case, a number, special characters. Oh, and you can't reuse the same password at every 4 or 5 months or for every 4 or 5 changes. That's a policy, and that's a non-technical control. And ideally, you'd want to take that and implement it into the system. It's kind of silly to have a policy that says, oh, you have to change your password every 30 days, and you can't repeat the last 4 or 5 or 6 if your password system doesn't enforce that. But that's the thing. And I had a kind of a bothersome conversation with one person when I was doing a job interview, and he said, oh, do I have any experience with controls? I said, oh yeah, I do. I've written policies and procedures and all these sort of things, and he was kind of like, I kind of acted like, oh, you didn't know what controls were. Because in his mind, controls were, I guess, were something technical only. And me, I'm like, sorry, I've been taught what controls are. There are non-technical and technical, and it's you who don't understand controls, not me. Of course, I didn't say that. But it's kind of frustrating that some people just don't fully understand some of these things. There are other type of controls: directive, preventive, detective, corrective, and so forth. Think about this as controls such as a preventive control. We use access control. Are you authorized to get into and access that data? If you can't, okay, well, that's a preventive control. We prevented you from getting access you have no business to. Or if you have a badge access, not quite a badge. So, in a lot of companies, if you have a badge, it doesn't get you anywhere you want. There are places you can't go to. So that's a preventative control. You don't have permission into that lab or that area, so you ain't getting in there. It's also we also have detective controls, i.e. we want to know what's going on. So in a way, that ID badge is also a detective control, i.e., oh, we found out you tried to get into there where you didn't belong, and we now know that. So maybe it was an accidental, but if we see you keeping trying to get in there, that's something to be mindful of. A deterrent control, you might not think about this, but one thing we do also with a lot of security, mainly with physical, is a deterrent control basically would be something that will basically just make people just go away. Don't even try. Oh, I can't break into that bank because they got security guards and they got barriers and this sort of stuff, so I'm just not going to bother. So that's a deterrent control. It kind of makes you go away. So some terms, assets, I talked about an asset, and the thing with assets you need to be mindful of is it's anything of value, but it's people, it's data, it's systems, it's physical systems like your laptop, but it could also be a database system, an email system. But it's saying, like I said, like people, if you work for your company, you have certain skills, you're an asset to your company. You need to be protected just as much as the company's database system. We don't think about that, but that's the case. Infrastructure, even reputation. Reputation is an asset that has to be protected. Threat, of course, is anything that is capable of acting on that asset, and it can be, again, an object, a substance, a person. Could be a hacker, or could be an event. We live in Florida. There's one threat that we have to worry about every year. Anyone? Exactly. And it's a threat. We're not in California, so we don't have to worry about earthquakes. That's another threat. But that's something that we had to think about. Threat event is when that occurs. A vulnerability is a weakness. This is a weakness in design, implementation, operation, or internal control. So a vulnerability could be, like I said, someone has written an operating system, and now we got some flaws, and it has to be patched. Kind of understand that. But it's also implementation. So this is the typical, someone takes the system, they install it, and they don't go and change the default passwords in the system. That's a typical way people do to try to break in. It's like, oh, let's try the default passwords. Let me get in there. Impact, of course, that's when, the impact is basically the magnitude of the harm caused by that exploit. And probability, sometimes the term is probability or likelihood. When I was taking a look, actually they're not quite the same, but I didn't want to muddy the waters. Taking it further, these are some other terms that are important to know, because we have risk assessment, risk analysis, risk evaluation. The reason I put these out is that I think for a lot of us, we probably think they're all the same, and they're really not. So a risk assessment is actually more the high-level term. It's just the process to identify and evaluate risks and its effects. So it's a high-level, broad thing. Analysis and evaluation is actually little subparts of a larger risk assessment process. So in essence, it goes deeper. Starts analyzing the value of the assets, identifying those threats, and evaluating how vulnerable. So it's a little bit more detailed work and evaluations. Then we say, okay, now we got these estimates. Let's do some comparisons of the risk to see what we should be addressing. And then risk management, that's again the bigger picture. When you talk about a risk management framework or a risk management program, that's the bigger thing. When I also was putting together this list, there's another couple of terms that I think should be brought up, and that is audit versus assessment. Now, does anyone think that audit and assessment is one and the same? Okay. Can anyone tell me really briefly what is an audit versus what it is an assessment? Okay, very good. And it's true. If you want to think about it really simply, is an audit would be either it's yes or no. Are you doing backups? Yes or no. That's an audit. How good are you doing in the audits on a scale from, like, say, 1 to 10? That would be an assessment. There is a difference, and different people are better doing an audit during an assessment. Now, one thing also I should point out is there's also all kind of different types of risks. And organizations, companies, many have had to deal with all these different types of risks. What we deal with in terms of information security is we're dealing with IT risk. Just one type of risk that actually falls under operational risk. We're not dealing with risk in general. We're not dealing with what's called enterprise risk. So if you start doing any sort of research and whatnot, you're trying to get information, I would recommend that you focus your searching whatever on IT risk versus just risk. And enterprise risk is also a bigger topic as well. And it's actually kind of funny. I was actually dealing with one of our clients. It's a healthcare company, and part of what we do when we do our assessments is we take a look at all their policies. And some of these people have a risk management program. Too often they don't. This organization did, and I'm going through the document going, oh, this is really impressive. They're dealing with taking a look at all these risks on a regular basis. They're worrying about, they might, what would do with it if a hurricane hits, and since they're healthcare, they're worried about, okay, what do they do if there's a pandemic or breakout of healthcare? And then I get to the end of the document, and I go, well, this is a really great document, except you're not looking at whatsoever at IT risk. What are you going to do if your IT systems go down? When someone hacks your system, brings them down, or someone steals, medical records, nothing. Everything else but IT risk, which isn't good because that was the main focus of what I was trying to do, was assess their IT program. Why care about risk? Again, we have all these threats that we have to worry about. The insider threat, that's area a lot of people are into, data loss, awareness training, APTs and DDoS. And this is part of why I felt this was an important talk, because one thing I get a little frustrated with in the information security realm is there seems to be a big focus when people start talking about information security as a career. All I hear about is, oh, I want to get into information security, and I want to fight the hackers, and I want to be red teaming, I want to be a pen tester, and yada, 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 yada. I'm like, that's great, but there's a lot more to information security than being a pen tester and on a red team. You're looking at one little part of what it is. There's a whole lot of other stuff. Unfortunately, I guess the other stuff isn't too sexy. I guess dealing with an incident response program, or looking at how are you preserving your data, having access control in place, or now it's called IAM, Identity and Access Management. I guess that's not sexy as fighting off the hackers and dealing with backups, and doing disaster recovery planning. I guess that's really boring, but there's more to it, and that's why it's real important. And part of that is understanding risk, because what you're going to focus on, what your organization should be focused on, they need to understand what are the risks to that organization and focus appropriately. And the hackers are a risk, no doubt about it, but they're just one thing we have to worry about. Like I said, we're in Florida, so we got to worry about hurricanes, and everything else, not just, the Russian hackers stealing our data or hacking the elections or whatever. And when you're in a regulated industry, you have to do risk management because it's required. So if your organization is a regulated industry, which is typically at this point finance and healthcare, you got to be doing risk management. It's required. So for those who aren't familiar with these, GLBA is Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. This came about when make sure the organization is doing certain things to protect data, and of course part of that is you had to have a risk assessment process. HIPAA is healthcare, and HIPAA applies to everyone involved with the healthcare industry, pretty much, from hospitals down to little doctor offices, as well as any company that is doing services for a healthcare entity, such that they have access to medical records. They're all subject to HIPAA. And those are the 2 points in the law, which, as I said, was pointed out in this little thing that says you must have a risk management program. FISMA, for those not familiar, FISMA is federal government basically mandating that any federal entity must follow certain standards to have a secure system. I'm seeing FISMA being used more and more. I'm seeing some of the state governments kind of like mandating that their state entities are following FISMA. I've heard of it. I'm not sure if it's true that even vendors, i.e. people doing services for the federal government, are told they must follow FISMA. FISMA is, not to get into too much detail, is defined in a group of documents from the NIST, the SP 800 and SP 153 and several others, which you can go and download for free. And of course they include risk assessment. PCI, which of course is credit cards. So if you process credit cards, got to be PCI compliant, and it includes having a risk assessment program. So the sad thing is that I even deal with some of the organizations that fall under these, and oftentimes they're not doing it, or they're doing it very poorly. So So I wanted to go over a basic model of risk management, how the process works. This is based on ISO 27005. I'll talk a little bit more about what that is a little bit later. But this is our basic risk management process. We actually use this in our organization with a lot of our clients. This picture I actually pulled off the internet. Go to Google Images, type risk management framework, and this is one of the ones that'll come up. I like it because it's like very nice and clean. So this is an overall risk management process, and I'll go over the different steps shortly. But you can see like they have this big blue box with risk assessment, and within risk assessment we have identification, analysis, and evaluation. As I said earlier, those are part of the overall risk assessment. So the first, okay, there's another cute cartoon. So the first part is the context, and this is kind of like laying the groundwork. That's getting everything in place. And so this, again, for a lot of people, this is like the really boring stuff because we got to get information, and hopefully, ideally, the company should have this information, but in most cases they don't. So information gathering, which is like gathering information about the organization. What is the organization all about? What's its purpose? What's its focus? You want to have what's called an asset inventory or asset register. Basically, what the heck are your assets? Remember what I said earlier, what are your assets? It's your people, it's your systems, it's your equipment, it's your data. You have laptops? Great. How many laptops do you have? How many servers do you have? What are your database systems? What kind of data do you have, and where is it? Who are your employees? All that. That should be gathered and put into what's either called an asset inventory or asset register. And you'll be surprised by how many times I go to organizations and I say, okay, let me see your asset inventory. They're like, asset inventory? I think we can pull something together. You got to have that because that's what you're protecting. You don't know what you're protecting. You can't go forward, and even not just in terms of risk, in terms of security. I mean, how can I put things in place to secure your environment if I don't know what the heck your environment is? Scope. Basically, what we mean here is if you're doing a risk management program or a process, is this for the entire company? Is it for just a business unit within the company? Because for large organizations, they may have different risk management programs in different areas. So maybe you've got a global company. Is this for the whole company, or is this for just North America? Or is it just for a certain business unit? Maybe it's the part of the company does this type of work, so we're just going to have the risk management program for that. The next two are things that we do not define as security professionals. This comes from the organization. One is called risk appetite. How much risk is the organization willing to take? Is this an organization that's very open to taking risks? Like many of your startup firms or your entrepreneurial type firms are very open to taking risks because they figure that if they take the big risks, they'll get the big rewards. The flip side is the ones that are very conservative organizations who are very risk adverse. They don't want to take risks. They want to avoid risks. But you need to define what that is, and that's defined by what's called the risk appetite. Then you have risk tolerance. Again, those are not the same, not interchangeable. So risk tolerance, again, is how much acceptable from a variation for a particular risk they're willing to take. And then you create something else called a risk register, which basically you gather all those risks and you basically list them and define them and add to them over the years. So then we get into, like I said, risk identification. We start identifying all those risks and we put them in the risk register. And what I mean by risk, I mean everything. We're in Florida, so I have to worry about hurricanes. That's a risk. We could have a fire. That's a risk. We can get flooded. That's a risk. We can get hacked. Another risk. Laptop could be stolen. Okay, that's another risk. And so on and so on. So we start adding all those risks into that register, and it's going to vary from place to place. Like I said, here in Florida, if I have an organization here, I'm going to have a risk register that isn't going to have things like, say, hopefully not a tsunami here in Florida. Certainly not an earthquake, but other things. And I tried to find some decent risk registers off of Google, and I really wasn't, I couldn't find one that I really, really liked. So this kind of give you kind of an idea. So this is one possible. We have then have the ID have different risks like loss of IT data, loss of IT voice, loss of records, and so forth. What would be the impact? What would be the likelihood? And then the risk rating for of each of those different type of risks occurring. And that gives us data in terms of like where do we want to focus our time on. This is another one. This is more for a project risk, but here it gets more complex, where the data is being added in terms of like, you make revisions and so forth. If you had a response to it that might improve it and so forth. Okay. Then you have risk analysis. Okay, we got these risks. Let's take a look at it. And this is where you can go off in different directions in terms of how you analyze risks. So one type is called quantitative risk analysis, where you create what are called risk scenarios, i.e. possible events and what could occur from them. And then you do things, this is all mathematical. So you have things like a single loss expectancy, annual rate of occurrence, and so forth. So annual rate of occurrence is how often would this happen? And for a single event, what would be the impact, the cost of that? And to be honest, the work I do is I don't get into quantitative because I don't have access to that sort of data to be able to do a good quantitative analysis. The other half is qualitative, which is basically more in percentages, where you deal with like the likelihood of event and then the impact. And if you're not quite sure how to keep the two straight, quantitative, think about quantity, so it's numbers. Qualitative is more quality, so think of percentage. So quantitative would be like, okay, this will happen and it'll cost us, so much a year potentially from the risk, versus the other one's like, okay, it'll probably be this rate of happening. Yes. In terms of the work I do as a consultant, because I can't sit down with the organization and say, okay, what is the dollar loss? If this happens, what's the dollar loss? What's the dollar impact? I can do comparisons. I say, hey, if this event occurs, we know based upon a similar organization, they were impacted and it cost them this much. In quantitative, oh yeah, this whole quantitative, risk management. Usually I see that more often in large organizations that can gather that sort of data and do a lot of work on it. There's one of the models I'll talk about is actually a quantitative model, and it gets like all the numbers and the costs and this sort of. And again, this also means you need to do a lot of that front work I talked about. Like again, if you got an asset, register, have you gone through and you figured out what is the value of what you have? And a lot of organizations, they don't. I mean, if we're lucky, they know equipment and the value of the equipment, but can they put a dollar value on their data? Most don't. And if he's one of your employees, what's the value of him? What's the value of losing him? Do you know that? They're not going to have that, unfortunately. Not that he don't have value, but they're not necessarily going to like, oh yeah, if we lose this guy for a week, it'll cost us this. They probably don't have an idea. And then what is it based on? Based on your salary or what you produce? And again, they're not going to have an idea. Again, as an assessor, I go in and I take a look and I take these are one of the areas where I didn't know if it could go too deep. But what I do is, as an assessor, I come in and take a look at how they're doing things, and then what's the impact. Where, like, I say, okay, you've got an incident response plan. It's pretty good. The likelihood of this occurring would be, high or low or what have you, and the impact would be such. But it's all kind of based more subjective, based on my knowledge and experience, based upon what I've taken a look at in terms of how they're doing things, how other organizations are doing it, to give kind of a rating. Yes. Right. It depends on the organization and who we're working with. Oftentimes we are working with the C-level people or close to it. And it also depends on how they're organized. In some cases, we're more dealing with, the CIO or the equivalent. So the IT people will bring us in to do it. We've had other words they say, well, it's more the finance people bringing us in. Sometimes it's like the finance people bringing us in because maybe they don't trust the IT people. Again, sometimes it gets into kind of the politics and how the organization is set up in terms of, how they're organized. And it gets kind of the strangeness in terms of, sometimes you get boards that are very flat, or basically you get the president, and then they have someone who's like the de facto CIO, even though he may not have that title, and they have like one guy who runs the IT department of like 3 or 4 people, and that's it. So you're not talking about, say, a big global, big large organization where they have, a CSO, Chief Security Officer, and a Chief Financial Officer, and they have a Chief Information Security Officer, and they have a CIO, and they have, each of them have whole departments. It just varies from organization to organization. It's not a whole lot of consistency. And I've also seen in some very, very large organizations now, they're having a chief risk officer. So, but again, what kind of risk are they doing? Is it IT risk, or is it enterprise risk? Not the same. As I said, IT risk would be a subset of enterprise risk. Again, it kind of depends, on who's bringing us in and whatnot. But a lot of them have, see a lot of value. Like, again, sometimes it's the politics, like and how they look at it, in terms of, because some groups are going to use us as either a stick or a carrot to get what they want, and that's in both in a good sense and a bad sense. I've had, we'd be brought in by, like say, the CIO or equivalent, and they want us to find problems and issues so they can then take that to the board and say, I need more money to fix these problems. And then you got the flip side where, someone's bringing us in so that, they can use it to beat someone else over the head about, you haven't done this, that you were supposed to. So it gets kind of the politics, if you will, of an organization. Some people want us there because they want us to find the issues, and others, want us to find the issues so they can go beat someone else because they haven't done anything about it. It gets kind of strange. Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, that's the whole idea of why you do that. I mean, there are risks out there. You only have so much money. What are you going to spend that money on? You want to focus on the important stuff, and we'll get more into that, shortly, because that's kind of the big part of why we're doing the risk management is we want to focus on where you need to spend the money on or spend your attention on. So, like I said, on the quantitative, like I said, is what I do with it is more of, like I said, a comparison of likelihood of occurring and the impact. So these are some of the ones you see. Like you'll see this, impact, likely, unlikely, very likely, of occurring, and then of course the impact and whether it's low, medium, high. Here they also have extreme. Sometimes I just see it as high. So if things are happening, if you've assessed something, where do you want to be focusing your time on? You want to be focusing your time on the stuff that falls under extreme, not the stuff that's down here in low. Here's one that goes even further, which is a 5x5 one, and yeah, you can see that here they have low, medium, high, very high. The next one I pulled off of Google. I thought that was kind of interesting how they did it. It even goes further. So they have over here likelihood, they call it probability, from very unlikely to almost certain. But I thought it was funny. It was like, okay, very unlikely is basically from 0 to 1%, whereas almost certain is 50 to 100%. Which I'm like, really? If it's 50 or 100, it's almost certain? Okay, I don't quite get that. And then they have the impact, the consequence, and they have some good comparisons, i.e. cost, what would be the cost impact, the time impact, the quality, and here they did a 6x5 comparison. But the thing, again, you want to focus on the stuff that's the highs, not the stuff over here. I used to do vulnerability scanning where I worked, and I'd get a report, of all these vulnerabilities that I was supposed to send to the system administrator to say, hey, these are vulnerabilities, go deal with them. You think I'm going to take all of them and send them to sysadmins to address? That's not worth their time. So what I had to do is I had to take that report and, if you will, get rid of the lows and the mediums. Because thankfully these reports would go and give a risk assessment of each issues. So you had like the low or the informational and the medium, and then you had high and critical. And basically everything that was below and it wasn't high or critical, I basically tossed out. It's not worth our time to work on that. Sent the rest to the sysadmin after I've kind of reviewed it to see, okay, there's something that maybe isn't really applicable to us, and then sent the rest of them to address. Because that's, part of how, you want them to be spending their time on what is appropriate. I don't know. This is like I said, I pulled it off of Google Images, and I thought this was kind of a neat, another way. So I have no idea where they're getting these percentages, but I still have this problem. Like 50 to 100 is almost certain. So it's just to me kind of strange, but I thought but it was also kind of interesting. So again, on risk evaluation, this is where we start determining risk to address, which is very important, and then set priorities. You want to address the highs and not the mediums. And here's some things to consider. You have something like what we saw that have a very high impact, very high likelihood, versus those that are very unlikely to happen, but could have a high impact. And you have things that could be very likely to happen, but have a low impact. Thing is also, there's also said that you have costs. Some things have a high impact and may be very cheap to address. I see that all the time. I go to a place and I say, you know what, you need a padlock on that door. It's a simple fix, and that'll address things. Some things could have a low cost, low impact, but be very costly to address. Should you address that? Maybe not. But maybe, think about this. Maybe it's something that's going to happen every year, and maybe over the time that's going to add up to that cost. But again, that's more of a business decision than, say, a decision that we would make. But you want to give that information to the business to make that decision. So then it gets into risk treatment. Okay, we got all these risks. What are we going to do about them? Does everyone think we're going to take all the risks and we're going to address everyone and put something in place to address those risks? You're not. The first was what they say, mitigation. We're going to fix the risk. System needs to be patched. We're going to patch it. You don't have a firewall. Let's put a firewall in place. That's addressing the risk, mitigating it. Here's one you might not think about. We just accept the risk. It's going to happen, but it's going to be very minimal, and it's going to be more costly to address it, so we'll just accept it. And we actually, if you think about it, we do this every day of our lives. It is risky to, say, cross the street, but we do it anyway. It's risky to get in our cars and drive someplace, but we do it anyway. The next one, I'm not sure if we can do it in IT, but we avoid the risk. I hear skydiving is really dangerous. You know what? I avoid that risk. I don't skydive. And it may be funny, but that is true. You can avoid it. And I don't know how you would do this in IT other than like, okay, let's say the Internet of Things is dangerous, so you will not put an IoT device on the network. We'll avoid that issue. You're not allowed to do that. For businesses, avoiding the risk would be things like, okay, it's really dangerous to enter into business, say, in Syria. We're going to avoid that by not doing business in Syria. And that seems funny, but that's really what it's all about. And then here's one is transfer. Does anyone know what we mean by transferring risk? Exactly. Insurance is transferring risk. And hopefully some of you have heard of something called cybersecurity insurance, which is kind of the big thing. What I don't like about cybersecurity insurance is some people seem to misuse it. They kind of had this attitude like oh, we'll just not do that or implement that. We'll just go get insurance. That'll take care of that. That's not what it's about. The idea of insurance, why we have car insurance, life insurance, and all the other, is to take care of or give ourselves coverage for a risk that is unlikely to occur, but if it does, it would be very, very costly. So organizations are getting cybersecurity insurance, but it doesn't get you off the hook, because they want you. Because we worked with one of our clients who's trying to get cybersecurity insurance, and there's a whole questionnaire. They're asking stuff. Do you have policies and procedures in place? Do you have a risk management program in place? Do you have an incident response plan? Do you have a disaster recovery plan? Right. I mean, that's the thing. Companies think they can get it. They can get it without getting the controls in place, and it doesn't work that way. Right. Right. And again, so you keep adding that until I think you reduce it to what's called residual risk. I think it's left over. So I'm actually running out of time. Let me move quicker. There's also a monitoring review. Here's the thing people need to understand. Risk management is not a once and done thing. It should be done regularly, ideally annually. The organization should come together, certain people, and review the risk, review that risk register, update it, add to it, change things. Some of the people are like, oh, we got to do this again? Yes, you do. You need to have someone to come and do audits and assessments on a regular basis. Some of our clients, they think that, oh, well, we'll just bring you in like every 2 or 3 years. That's good, isn't it? No. But it's ongoing. I like this one I pulled off. Number of risks identified, few loads. That looks good. There are other frameworks out there. I want to touch on them really quickly. OCTAVE, FAIR, the stuff from NIST. So quickly, OCTAVE. I actually brought the book with me if anyone wants to see it afterwards. Comes from SEI, the Software Engineering Institute. It's an acronym. They've actually had different versions. The first one was really big and overwhelming. Then they went to the next version, which was S, which was simple. And the first one is called Allegro. And guess what? You can get Allegro for free. Go to SEI's website. You can download the guidebook, and it'll help you out. Here's the steps. Risk management criteria, getting the missions, organizations, create a profile of each critical asset. Same kind of familiar. Identify threats to each asset. And analyze the risk and to come up with a way to address it. So a lot of these frameworks are very, very similar. They use different terminology. Where they differ is more the lower level details than what I can get into today. FAIR is another one that's come from the FAIR Institute. There's a whole book. You can get it. I don't have a copy yet. But this is a quantitative model. Like I said, you asked about quantitative. This is a quantitative risk model. And the idea with this one is such that you can just take FAIR and kind of drop it into whatever risk management program you have because you use this for the analysis part. NIST, there's a couple from there. There's 30, which is the risk assessment model, and 39, which is the risk management model. And again, despite some differences in terminology, it's actually fairly similar to what I just showed you. And if you want to see these, you can download them for free from NIST. I'm not sure if this is readable. So it's kind of the same thing, identification, figure out the controls, figure out the likelihood, what the impact is, determine the risk, what the control is, and so forth. And over there is how you mitigate. And I also, again, I pulled these off of Google. Google Images, You know, I think I did NIST 830, and these were a couple of ones that pulled up. 27,000. Okay, I'm not sure if people are aware of ISO. ISO has various standards. There's the 27,000 series. That's all information security standards. 27,001 and 2 sets down what's called an ISMS, Information Security Management System, a standard of how to build a secure environment. Compare that to FISMA, compare that to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, and so forth. Within that series of documents is 27,005, which is about risk management. What I showed you earlier is based on 27,005. Sadly, if you want these, you have to pay for them. Sorry. They're not cheap. Here's a comparison. I actually pulled this in fairly different sources. But again, different terminology, but pretty much the same, which is weird. So resources, quickly. Certifications, there's several out there. One I would recommend you take a look at is CRISC. That's Certified in Risk and IS Controls from ISACA. That's the only one I know of. It's about IT risks and IT controls. And it's a pretty good thing. There are also other training for, like FAIR has training, 27,005 and so forth. But CRISC is probably the one you want to take a look at. There are courses out there to have these certs. I also saw that SANS has this 2-day course on cybersecurity risk management. I don't know anything about it. I've never been through it, so I assume it's pretty decent. Books, there's quite a few books. I brought a few of them with me. The first two actually are general books about risk, like Against the Gods, The Remarkable Story of Risk. This is kind of like, if you will, an introduction to risk in general, not IT risk. The rest are more about IT risk. You know, COBIT 5 is a big management framework, and of course they include risk, so they have risk for COBIT 5 and so forth. The C-Risk Review Manual, I brought my old one. It's a little bit dated, it's from a few years ago, so if anyone takes a look at it, I'll be outside. SINGRIS has several good books. One I liked is I think it's the Risk Assessment Toolkit, because they talk about these different frameworks I talked about, and also gives you information in terms of what's good and bad about the different ones. So you can see, okay, which one should I work with? And I actually have brought copies of a few of those if you want to see afterwards. Others, I said the FAIR book. All the NIST books you can download from the NIST website. The Allegro guidebook, you can get that from the website. I have a blog, Michael on Security at Blogspot. I will upload on there a posting with all these resources, and if possible links to and so forth. So make it easy for you guys. Like I said, I'll probably hang out over at the Hack Miami table afterwards, and if you have any questions and so forth. And again, I have some giveaway items if anyone who came in new would like to pick up something. So how are we doing on time? Got a couple more minutes. Yes? You do the best you can. And the thing is also, if people would, if they would just do, they would implement a proper information security management framework system, they could hopefully, if these things occur, they can usually handle them. And that gets into things such as, hey, you're going to get into what's now being called resilience, where you can hopefully have a better organized system that if something unexplained to happen, at least you can do the best you can to kind of mitigate from it. That's why you have disaster recovery plans and incident response, so that even something unforeseen, you at least got something in place to handle, as opposed to, what are we going to do? Yeah, because you have one plan that can handle, hopefully, anything. You know, you don't want to have, oh, here's our plan for hurricanes, and here's our totally separate plan for tornadoes, and here's our totally separate plan for hackers. No, you have a disaster recovery plan. Because if you look at in an incident response plan, you get to the point where, okay, you've got your system is damaged. What do? We will then implement our existing disaster recovery plan to get the business back up and running. I would think finance, mainly because of its being regulated. You know, if they're forced to have a risk management program, and so they're going to do it. Most do, but sometimes again I've seen some scary stuff. So You know, you kind of think like, what you're supposed to be doing a better job than this, and you're doing this, you know. But that's the thing. I mean, if you got, you know, here's the thing. I mean, with like the banking industry, the regulators come by and check up on them. You know, they want to see things. I mean, some of our clients have come to us because the regulators came by and took a look at what they're doing, and were doing a very good job, and they came to us for help. You know, other industries, they don't have someone coming by and saying, show me what you're doing. You're not doing good. You need to fix this. You know, that's not yet there in healthcare. You know, OCR is doing audits and whatnot, but OCR is not coming by all the hospitals and saying, let's take a look at what you're doing, you know, and say you need to do better. It's not, whether that's the right thing or the wrong thing, or that's just how it is. I saw. Well, SCADA could pretty much use anything, because I mean, most of these, I mean, if you look at, they don't get into you know, the low-level detail. I mean, most of them can be applied across the board. Doesn't matter about the industry. I mean, if you look at things like the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, ISO 27001, you know, it doesn't get too detailed in terms of, oh, you can't apply this to this industry or that industry, and it takes into consideration, hey, you may have to make some tweaks and changes, add things to make it more appropriate for you, you know, and so forth. So it's almost a one-size-fits-all with the understanding that, hey, we can twist it around a little bit to make it fit. Yeah, so it's not quite cookie cutter. Okay, I think I am out of time. Like I said, I'll hang around at the Hack Miami table out front if people want to chat with me.